He was the town doctor, also the greatest serial killer I've ever seen. The town of Oakhaven didn't have a hospital. We just had Dr. Sterling. He was the kind of man who brought soup to your house before he even checked your pulse. A pillar of the community who had delivered half the babies in the county and held the hands of the other half as they breathed their last. But I started noticing that every patient who got better suddenly took a turn for the worse on Friday nights. That's when I found the peppermint tins in his desk, and let me tell you, they didn't contain candy. This is how I discovered that our town's savior was actually its most prolific predator. Have you ever trusted someone with your life only to realize they were the one taking it? If this story chills you, hit the like button and subscribe for more true encounters. Now, here's what happened. I'm Sarah. I'm 34 years old, and for a long time I was a hospice nurse. People think that job is all about sadness, but it's really about peace. It's about making sure the end of the road isn't terrifying. Or at least that's what I used to believe. I moved to Oakhaven, West Virginia about 3 years ago. I was burnt out, plain and simple. I'd spent nearly a decade in a high intensity in the city, surrounded by sirens, screaming, and the kind of trauma that starts to eat holes in your soul. I wanted a slow-paced life. I wanted to hear the wind in the trees instead of sirens on the pavement. I found a drafty little apartment above a hardware store on the main strip of Oakhaven, and for a while it felt like exactly what I needed. The town is beautiful in that rugged Appalachian way. It's tucked into a valley where the fog settles thick and white every morning, looking like a heavy blanket draped over the pine trees. Everyone knows everyone. You can't walk into the diner without 3 people asking how your mother is doing, even if your mother lives 2 states away. It's the kind of place where doors are left unlocked and trust isn't earned. It's just the default setting. At the center of that trust was Dr. Arthur Sterling. He was 62, with silver hair that always looked perfectly combed and a voice that sounded like warm honey. He operated out of a converted Victorian house at the end of a long, graveled driveway. To the people of Oakhaven, he wasn't just a doctor, he was a saint. I started working for him as a night shift nurse. The clinic had a small infirmary wing for elderly patients who needed short-term monitoring, but didn't want to make the hour-long drive to the regional hospital in the next county. It was quiet work. Mostly checking vitals, changing 4 bags, and making sure everyone was comfortable. Dr. Sterling was a dream to work for, or so I thought. He was a mentor to me. He'd stay late, sitting in his office with the green-shaded lamp on, sipping tea and talking to me about the philosophy of care. He told me we were like gardeners. He said a good doctor knows when to water a plant and when to recognize that it's simply time for the bloom to fade. At the time, I thought it was poetic. Now I realize it was a confession. The first time I felt that cold prickle of unease was about 6 months into the job. We had a patient named Mr. Henderson. He was 82, a retired carpenter who still had a grip like a vice. He'd been admitted for a mild bout of pneumonia, nothing that should have been fatal. He was responding well to the antibiotics. On Thursday afternoon, he was sitting up in bed, joking with me about how he was going to outlive us all. He looked me in the eye and told me he couldn't wait to get home to work on a birdhouse he'd started. He was vibrant. He was healing. But when I came in for my shift on Friday night, the atmosphere in the clinic felt different. It was heavy. The air was thick with the scent of something sweet, almost cloying. I went to check the morphine logs first, which was standard procedure. As I scanned the digital entries, my finger stopped on Mr. Henderson's file. He had passed away at 6:42 p.m. The cause of death was listed as sudden respiratory failure due to complications from pneumonia. I felt a lump form in my throat. I'd just seen him. He was fine. I went into the supply room to start the inventory, and that's when I saw it. The used vial of morphine that had been discarded in the Sharps container. It was a 30 milliliters vial, and it was completely empty. I looked back at the log. Dr. Sterling had recorded a dose of only 5 milliliters for comfort care. My heart started to beat a little faster against my ribs. In hospice and palliative care, you learn to be precise. A discrepancy like that isn't a typo, it's a lethal mistake or a choice. I waited until Dr. Sterling came out of his office. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the town was resting on them. He saw me and offered a sad, sympathetic smile. He walked over and patted my hand, his skin feeling like cold parchment. I told him about the log. I told him I'd seen the vial and that the math didn't add up. I remember my voice shaking just a little bit. I was a city nurse. I was used to protocols. Here, everything felt more fluid. He didn't get angry. He didn't even look surprised. He just sighed, a long, weary sound, and looked at me with those fatherly eyes. He told me I must have misread the label. He said the exhaustion of the night shift was clearly getting to me, and that I should be careful about making accusations that could ruin a reputation. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vintage tin of peppermints. He popped one into his mouth and offered me the tin. "Wake up, Sarah," he said softly. "You're seeing ghosts where there are only tired old men. Take a mint. It'll clear your head." I took the tin, but I didn't eat one. The smell was overpowering. It was sharp, clinical, and so strong it made my eyes water. As he walked away, the scent lingered in the hallway, mixing with the smell of floor wax and old wood. It was the first time I realized that whenever Dr. Sterling lost a patient, whenever a turn for the worse happened on a Friday, he always smelled like peppermint. It was on his breath, on his clothes, a sickly, sweet mask for whatever else was happening in those rooms. But that was just the beginning. I'd tried to tell myself he was right. I was tired. I was overthinking things because of my past trauma in the ER. I wanted to believe in the saint of Oakhaven. But over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop looking at the logs. I started staying a few minutes late or arriving 20 minutes early, just to cross-reference the digital records with the physical vials in the disposal. The patterns were undeniable. Every Friday night, a patient who was supposed to be recovering would have a crisis. And every time the medication used was far in excess of what was recorded, it was always the same. A sudden decline, a quiet room, and Dr. Sterling standing there in the aftermath, sucking on a peppermint. I started to notice other things too. The clinic's digital backup system, which was supposed to store years of medical history, was being manually wiped every 48 hours. I found this out when I tried to look up Mr. Henderson's previous vitals to prove he'd been improving. The file was gone. When I asked the IT contractor who came in once a month, he told me the wipes were being triggered from an off-site IP address. Someone was cleaning the slate over and over again. I felt like I was losing my mind. I lived in a town where this man was a god. If I went to the local sheriff, I'd be laughed out of the office. Sheriff Miller's youngest son had been saved by Sterling after a nasty tractor accident 2 summers ago. The town wouldn't believe me. They didn't want to believe me. One night, while Dr. Sterling was out on a house call, I found myself standing in front of his private office door. It was a heavy oak door, always locked. But that night, in his haste to leave for an emergency, he hadn't quite turned the deadbolt. The door was ajar by less than an inch. My pulse was drumming in my ears, a frantic, rhythmic thumping that felt like it was echoing off the walls of the empty clinic. I knew I shouldn't go in. I knew that if I crossed that threshold, there was no going back to the quiet, peaceful life I'd moved here to find. I pushed the door open. The office was exactly as I imagined, walls lined with leather-bound books, the smell of expensive tobacco, and that ever-present, faint undertone of mint. I went straight for his desk. I wasn't looking for medical files. I was looking for the truth. I started pulling open drawers, my hands trembling so hard I could barely grip the handles. Most of it was mundane, stationery, pens, old letters. But then I opened the bottom right drawer. It was filled with small silver teens, dozens of them. They were identical to the one he'd given me. I picked one up, expecting to hear the rattle of candy. Instead, it was silent. I pried the lid open, and my breath hitched in my throat. Inside, resting on a bed of cotton wool, was a gold wedding band. It was worn thin, the kind of ring someone wears for 50 years and never takes off. There was a small piece of surgical tape stuck to the inside of the lid. On it, in Dr. Sterling's precise, elegant handwriting, was a name, Henderson, and a date. The air in the room suddenly turned ice cold. I realized then that he wasn't just a doctor. He wasn't a gardener pruning his garden. He was a collector. He was keeping trophies from the people he'd sent to their final rest. I reached for another tin, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. This one contained a lock of white hair. The next, a hearing aid. The one after that, a single gold tooth. Each one had a name. Each one had a date. And as I looked at the sheer number of tins filling that drawer, I realized that the Angel of Oakhaven had been busy for a very, very long time. That's when I heard the sound of gravel crunching in the driveway outside. Dr. Sterling was back, and I was standing in the middle of his secrets with the evidence in my shaking hands. I realized I was next on his rounds. The town didn't want to believe me, but they were going to have to, or I was going to end up in a silver tin just like the rest of them. But that was just the start of the nightmare. I didn't know then how deep the roots of his garden really went. I didn't know that the basement of that Victorian house held things much worse than wedding rings. I just knew that the smell of peppermint was no longer the scent of a kind old man. It was the smell of death, and it was getting closer. The sound of tires on gravel is a distinct noise in a quiet town like Oakhaven. It's a rhythmic, crunching grind that usually signals a visitor or a neighbor coming home. But that night, standing in Dr. Sterling's darkened office with a dead man's wedding ring in my hand, that sound was a death knell. My heart didn't just race. It felt like it was trying to punch its way out of my chest. I had seconds. I shoved the peppermint tin back into the drawer, trying to remember the exact alignment of the silver containers. My hands were slick with sweat, making the metal lids slide and click against each other with a sound that seemed loud enough to wake the dead in the next room. I closed the drawer as softly as I could, the wood on wood slide feeling like an eternity. I slipped out of the office, pulling the heavy oak door shut until I heard the faint metallic click of the latch. I didn't have time to see if the deadbolt had engaged. I practically threw myself toward the supply closet down the hall, grabbing a stack of fresh linens and a bottle of disinfectant. I was leaning over a cart, pretending to check the inventory, when the front door of the clinic groaned open. The bell attached to the frame gave a cheerful little chime that felt like a mockery of my terror. I kept my back to the entrance, my breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. I forced myself to count. 1, 2, 3. Sarah? Still here? His voice was as smooth as silk, carrying that practiced, grandfatherly warmth that I now knew was a mask. I turned around, plastering a tired, professional smile on my face. Dr. Sterling was standing in the foyer, shaking a few droplets of rain off his umbrella. He looked perfectly normal. He looked like the man the whole town trusted with their lives. But all I could see were his hands, those steady surgeon's hands, and I wondered how many of those rings he had slid off cold, stiff fingers. I told him I was just finishing up the restock for the morning shift. I waited for the accusation, for him to ask why I had been in his office or why the air in there still smelled like my panicked sweat. But he just nodded, hanging his coat on the brass rack. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a peppermint, and unwrapped it with agonizing slowness. The crinkle of the cellophane was the only sound in the hallway. He popped the candy into his mouth, the sharp medicinal scent of mint immediately filling the space between us. He looked at me for a long beat, his eyes obscured by the reflection of the overhead lights on his glasses. Then he smiled. "Good work, Sarah. You're a dedicated soul. Don't stay too late. We wouldn't want you getting overwhelmed." I left as quickly as I could without running. I drove back to my apartment above the hardware store with my grip so tight on the steering wheel that my knuckles went white. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by my window, looking out over the empty main street of Oakhaven, watching the fog roll in from the mountains. I kept thinking about the math. 40 years. Dr. Sterling had been the only doctor here for 40 years. If he took one trophy a month, that was nearly 500 people. Even if it was only a few a year, the drawer I'd seen was just the tip of the iceberg. I felt a crushing sense of isolation. Who was I going to tell? The sheriff who owed him his son's life? The pharmacist who had been his best friend since grade school? The next few days were a blur of paranoia and performance. I had to go back. I had to act like nothing had changed, even though the very air in the clinic now felt poised. Every time I passed Dr. Sterling in the hall, I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. I started watching him more closely, looking past the charm. I noticed how he'd linger in the doorway of a patient's room, not checking their chart, but just watching them, like a hunter observing a deer in the brush. He was waiting for the right moment. He was waiting for a Friday. I decided to do some digging of my own. If I couldn't trust the digital files, I'd look for the physical traces people leave behind. Oakhaven is the kind of place where people don't just disappear. They move away. They go to live with a daughter in Ohio, or they find a retirement community in Florida. At least that's the story the town tells itself when a chair at the diner stays empty. I spent my afternoon off at the local library using the slow internet to look up some of the names I'd seen on those peppermint tins. I started with Mrs. Higgins. She was a sweet woman who had been a regular at the clinic for years. 6 months ago, she supposedly moved to Sarasota to be near her sister. I found her obituary in a Florida newspaper, but it wasn't a Sarasota paper. It was a tiny local circular from a town 3 hours away from where she was supposed to be. And the date of death? It was 3 days after she allegedly left Oakhaven. The cause was listed as a sudden stroke, but there was no mention of a sister. In fact, according to the public records, Mrs. Higgins was an only child. My stomach turned. He wasn't just killing them, he was orchestrating their exits. He was making sure there were no loose ends, no family members asking questions, no reason for the town to look twice at an empty house. He was the one who helped them pack. He was the one who coordinated the move. He was the architect of their disappearances. The weight of it was starting to crack me. I couldn't eat. Every time I smelled the mint in my toothpaste, in a stick of gum, in the tea I drank to calm my nerves, I felt like I was going to be sick. I started seeing him everywhere. I'd be at the grocery store and I'd see his silver Volvo parked at the end of the lot. I'd be walking to my apartment, and I'd swear I saw a figure standing in the shadows of the alleyway, the faint glow of a cigarette or a reflected lens catching the light. I told myself I was being hysterical. I told myself that my mind was playing tricks because I was exhausted. Then came the incident with the trash. It was a Tuesday night. A few days before the next Friday turn, I was taking the medical waste out to the specialized bins behind the clinic. The wind was whipping through the valley, whistling through the gaps in the old Victorian siding of the building. As I tossed a bag into the bin, I saw something caught in the lid of the regular trash can, the one doctor. Sterling used for his private office. It was a plastic strip, bright blue and familiar. I reached out and pulled it free. It was a medical identification bracelet, the kind we put on patients when they're admitted to the infirmary wing. I wiped the grime off the plastic window and read the name, Eleanor Gable. Eleanor Gable had moved to a nursing home in Charleston 3 months ago. She was a wealthy widow who lived in a massive house on the edge of town, a woman with no children and a lot of antique jewelry. Why was her ID bracelet in Dr. Sterling's private trash 3 months after she'd left? You don't keep those. You certainly don't bring them back from a nursing home 3 counties away. I tucked the bracelet into my pocket, my mind racing. He was getting sloppy, or maybe he was getting arrogant. Maybe after 40 years of being a god in a small town, you stop worrying about the dirt on your shoes. That night, the shift felt endless. Dr. Sterling was in a particularly good mood. He spent an hour in the break room with me, talking about the upcoming winter and how the town needed to prepare for the heavy snows. He was charming, witty, and perfectly composed. But as he talked, I couldn't stop thinking about the blue plastic bracelet in my pocket. I couldn't stop thinking about the wedding rings in his desk. I looked at his mouth as he spoke, watching the way his lips moved. And all I could think about was the paralyzing dose of morphine he'd given Mr. Henderson. "You're very quiet tonight, Sarah," he said, tilting his head. The light caught his glasses, turning them into 2 blank white circles. "Is something on your mind? You've been looking a bit pale lately. I hope you're taking care of yourself. This job, it can take a lot out of a person if they don't have the right constitution. I'm just tired." "Doctor," I managed to say, my voice sounding thin and hollow to my own ears. "The change in weather, I think. Yes, the seasons. Life and death. The great cycle," he mused, standing up. He walked over to the window and looked out at the dark tree line. "Some people fight the cycle. They cling to the vine long after the frost has come. It's a tragedy, really, to lose your dignity because you're afraid of the dark." He turned back to me, and for a split second, the mask slipped. His expression wasn't fatherly. It was cold. It was clinical. It was the look of a man who viewed human beings as specimens to be managed. I like to think I help people find their dignity. Wouldn't you agree? I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just nodded and went back to my rounds. I felt like I was walking through a dream, the kind where you're screaming but no sound comes out. I realized then that he wasn't just watching his patients, he was watching me. He knew I was looking. He was testing me, seeing if I had the constitution to be his accomplice or if I was just another weed that needed to be pulled from his garden. When my shift finally ended at 7 a.m., I practically ran to my car. I didn't go straight home. I drove out to the edge of town, to the old Gable estate. I don't know what I expected to find. The house was shuttered, a for sale sign leaning crookedly in the overgrown front yard. It looked abandoned, a silent monument to a woman who had been erased. I sat there in my car, the engine idling, and I realized that I was completely alone. If I disappeared tomorrow, the town would just say I moved back to the city. They'd say the pace of Oakhaven was too slow for me. And Dr. Sterling would be the one to tell them. I drove back to my apartment, my head throbbing. I climbed the stairs, fumbled with my keys, and pushed open the door. I just wanted to crawl into bed and hide from the world. But as I stepped into my bedroom, I stopped dead. My bed was made just as I'd left it, but sitting right in the center of my pillow was a small, silver object. It caught the morning light filtering through the blinds, a sharp, metallic glint that made my heart stop. I walked closer, my legs feeling like lead. It was a peppermint tin. I didn't have to open it to know what was inside. I knew the smell, I knew the weight, but I opened it anyway. Inside, resting on a bed of white cotton, was a small silver nursing pin. My nursing pin. The one I'd lost 3 days ago and assumed I'd dropped in the laundry. There was no note, no message. Just the tin sitting on my pillow inside my locked apartment. The message was loud and clear. Asterisk, I can get to you. I can be in your home while you sleep. I know who you are. Asterisk, I dropped the tin, and the sound of it hitting the hardwood floor was like a gunshot. The peppermint scent exploded into the room, filling my lungs, choking me. He wasn't just a doctor anymore, he was a shadow. And the shadow was moving in. But that was just the beginning of the end. Then the noises came back, and I realized I wasn't the only one he was watching. I realized I was the next trophy. I didn't call the police. That's the thing people always ask when I tell this story. Why didn't you just call the cops? But you have to understand the geography of a place like Oakhaven. The sheriff's office was 3 doors down from the clinic. Sheriff Miller and Dr. Sterling had Sunday dinner together every week for 20 years. If I called, Sterling would know before the sirens even started. And after finding that tin on my pillow, I knew he wasn't just a doctor with a dark secret. He was a predator who had marked his territory. My apartment, my sanctuary, was no longer mine. The air in the room felt heavy, saturated with the cloying, sharp scent of peppermint that seemed to cling to the curtains and the bedsheets. I felt like a fly in a web, and the spider was currently humming a tune in his office, waiting for the vibrations to tell him I was struggling. I spent the next day in a state of functional shock. I went to the hardware store downstairs and bought a new deadbolt, but as I was installing it, my hands were shaking so hard the screwdriver kept slipping, gouging the wood of the door frame. I kept looking over my shoulder at the empty hallway. Every creak of the old building sounded like a footstep. Every shadow cast by the afternoon sun looked like a man in a white coat. I realized then that Sterling didn't need to kill me to destroy me. He was already doing it. He was dismantling my sanity piece by piece just to see how the machine worked. I went into my shift that Thursday night because I was too terrified to stay home and even more terrified of what he would do if I didn't show up. If I broke the routine, I was admitting I knew. And if I knew I was a liability he had to prune. The clinic was deathly quiet when I arrived. The fog had rolled in early, a thick gray soup that swallowed the streetlights and muffled the world. Dr. Sterling was in the infirmary, sitting by the bed of a new patient, an elderly man named Mr. Whitaker, who had been admitted for observation after a fainting spell. Sterling was holding the man's hand, speaking in that low, soothing rumble of a voice. He looked up as I entered, and his smile was blinding. "Sarah, glad you're here. Mr. Whitaker was just telling me about his garden." We were discussing the importance of timing. He squeezed the old man's hand, and I saw Mr. Whitaker gaze at him with pure, unadulterated adoration. It made my skin crawl. It was the look of a lamb looking at a butcher, as if he were a shepherd. Throughout the night, I felt his eyes on me. He didn't say much, but he was always asterisk there, asterisk. If I went to the nurse's station, he was in the hallway. If I went to the supply closet, he was passing by the door. It was a psychological siege. I felt my clinical detachment. The one thing that had kept me sane in the city began to crumble. I wasn't a nurse anymore. I was a witness. And in Oakhaven, being a witness was a death sentence. Around 2 a.m., Sterling announced he was heading down to the basement archives to look for some old patient records. The basement was a place I'd never been. It was where the old boiler lived, along with decades of paper files from before the digital age. He took his ring of keys, gave me a polite nod, and disappeared behind the heavy steel door near the back of the clinic. This was my chance. I knew I couldn't go back to his office. He'd likely rigged the door or the desk after my last intrusion, but the basement, he'd never seen me show any interest in the archives. I waited 10 minutes, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, before I followed. The stairs were steep and narrow, the air growing colder and damper with every step. The scent of mold and old paper began to compete with the ever-present smell of mint. I reached the bottom and stood in the shadows. The basement was a labyrinth of tall wooden shelves packed with cardboard boxes. A single naked light bulb flickered at the far end of the row, casting long, dancing shadows. I could hear the rhythmic asterisk thump hiss asterisk of the boiler, sounding like the heartbeat of the building. Far off to the left, I saw a sliver of light coming from a small enclosed room, the archives office. I moved quietly, my soft-soled nursing shoes making no sound on the concrete floor. As I passed the rows of boxes, I saw names I recognized. People who had moved away, people whose houses were now occupied by younger families, who had no idea whose ghosts they were living with. But I wasn't looking for paper. I was looking for the source of the collection. Near the back of the archive room, tucked under a heavy canvas tarp, I saw the corner of something that didn't belong. I pulled the tarp back, my breath catching in a throat that felt like it was filled with sand. It was a vintage leather medical bag, the kind doctors used to carry on house calls in the 1950s. It was worn, the brown leather cracked and scarred, but it was fitted with a heavy brass padlock. I don't know what possessed me. Maybe it was the desperation, the need to have something undeniable to show the world. I grabbed a heavy metal hole punch from a nearby desk and used it as a lever. I shoved the handle through the lock's shackle and pulled with everything I had. My muscles screamed, and for a second I thought the desk would tip over. Then, with a sharp, metallic crack asterisk that echoed like a gunshot in the cramped space, the lock gave way. I opened the bag, and the smell hit me first. It wasn't just peppermint. It was the smell of a funeral home formaldehyde, dried flowers, and something metallic. The bag was packed tight. It didn't contain medicine. It contained hundreds of those silver peppermint tins. They were stacked in rows, organized by year. I pulled one out at random. Inside was a set of dentures. Another contained a hearing aid. A third held a small, delicate porcelain doll that looked like it had been taken from a child's bedside, but it was the fourth one that broke me. I opened it and found a small, blood-stained piece of a blue hospital gown. Folded inside the scrap of fabric was a handwritten note. The ink faded, but the script unmistakably Sterling's. It didn't list a medical condition. It listed a time of death and a single word. Asterisk perfected. Asterisk. He wasn't just killing them, he was perfecting them. In his twisted mind, life was a messy, flawed process, and death was the only way to achieve a state of permanent grace. He wasn't a doctor. He was a sculptor, and the people of Oakhaven were his clay. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to lean against the shelving unit. The sheer scale of it was impossible to grasp. There were hundreds of tins in this bag alone. How many bags were there? How many decades had he been doing this? I realized then that the town didn't just trust him. They belonged to him. Every family in Oakhaven had someone in this bag. That's when the humming stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant asterisk thump hiss asterisk of the boiler. I looked toward the archive office. The sliver of light was gone. My blood turned to ice. I had been so focused on the bag that I hadn't heard the door open. I hadn't heard the footsteps. It's quite a collection, isn't it? The voice came from the darkness at the end of the row. Dr. Sterling stepped into the dim light of the flickering bulb. He wasn't wearing his glasses, and without them, his eyes looked sunken and dark, like two holes burned into a sheet of parchment. He was holding a small silver tray, and on it sat a single glass of water and a small amber vial. I've spent 40 years curating this town, Sarah," he said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. It was flat, clinical, and utterly terrifying. "I've seen them through their first breaths and their last. I know their secrets. I know their fears. And I know when they're ready to be preserved. Most people don't know how to leave a room with grace. They linger. They rot. I simply provide the exit." He began to walk toward me, his movements slow and deliberate. I backed away, my heels hitting the edge of the leather bag. I felt trapped, a cornered animal in a basement full of ghosts. "I had high hopes for you," he continued, his tone almost mournful. "I thought you understood the burden of the gardener. But you're not a gardener, Sarah. You're a weed. You're trying to choke the life out of something beautiful because you're afraid of the dark." He stopped a few feet away from me. The smell of peppermint was so strong now it was suffocating, a thick, invisible wall between us. He held up the amber vial. "This is a very special blend. It doesn't hurt. It just slows things down. It allows the mind to catch up with the body. You'll be my most prized addition, Sarah." A witness, finally made silent. Finally perfected. I looked at the stairs, but he was blocking the only way out. I looked at the heavy hole punch still in my hand, my knuckles white as I gripped the cold metal. I realized then that he wasn't going to let me leave. Not as a person. Only as a trophy in a tin. "The town won't miss you," he whispered, taking another step. "They'll say you were troubled. They'll say you couldn't handle the quiet. And they'll believe me, because I'm the one who takes care of them." The truth was hidden in plain sight. And the worst part? He knew my name. He knew every part of me he wanted to keep, but that was just the beginning of the end. As the air in the room turned ice cold, I realized I had to do something I'd never done in my career as a nurse. I wasn't going to save a life. I was going to have to fight for mine. But as he lunged, I realized the doctor had one more secret he hadn't shared yet, and it was waiting for me in the dark. I stood there, backed against the cold, damp concrete of the archives, clutching that heavy metal hole punch like it was a shield. But you have to understand, I wasn't a fighter. I was a nurse. My entire life had been dedicated to the preservation of breath, to the steady beat of a heart, to the comfort of the dying. Dr. Sterling, however, had spent 40 years mastering the exact opposite. He didn't look like a monster. He didn't growl or roar. He just stood there with that amber vial, his expression as calm and focused as if he were checking a blood pressure reading. Outside, the wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that rattled the old Victorian windows upstairs. The snowstorm we'd been hearing about for days had finally arrived, slamming into the valley with a sudden, violent intensity. It felt like the world was being erased, one snowflake at a time, leaving only this basement and the two of us. I could hear the power lines outside groaning under the weight of the ice. The flickering light bulb above us hummed, then died, leaving us in a thick, suffocating darkness broken only by the dim orange glow of the boiler's pilot light. "The storm is a blessing, Sarah." Sterling's voice drifted through the dark, sounding closer than before. I could hear the soft scuff of his shoes on the concrete. "It provides the silence necessary for the transition. No phones, no neighbors, no interruptions, just the work." I swung the hole punch blindly into the dark, but I hit nothing but air. My breath was coming in ragged, shallow gasps. I was thinking like a nurse, even then. I was calculating the onset time of whatever was in that vial. If it was a paralyzing agent, a neuromuscular blocker like succinylcholine, I'd be awake. I'd be able to see and feel everything, but I wouldn't be able to move a single muscle. I wouldn't even be able to blink. My lungs would eventually stop, and I'd suffocate while staring into his eyes. The clinical horror of it was worse than the fear of death itself. It was the fear of being a specimen. "I've already picked out your tin," he whispered. I felt a sudden, sharp sting in my shoulder. He'd moved with the silent, practiced speed of a predator. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat as a wave of unnatural cold spread from the injection site. It felt like liquid lead was being poured into my veins, heavy and slow, dragging my limbs down. I collapsed. My knees hit the concrete first, then my hip, but I didn't feel the pain. Not really. It was as if my body was becoming a distant country, a place I no longer had the map for. I could feel the grit of the basement floor against my cheek. I could smell the dust, the dampness, and that overwhelming, sickening scent of peppermint. Sterling knelt beside me. He didn't touch me roughly. He rolled me onto my back with a gentle, practiced ease, as if he were repositioning a patient to prevent bed sores. He produced a small flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness like a scalpel. He shone it directly into my eyes. I wanted to look away, to curse him, to spit in his face, but my eyelids were already frozen open. My pupils didn't even contract. I was becoming a statue. "You have such a sharp mind, Sarah," he said, his face appearing in the periphery of the light. He looked genuinely sad. "It's a shame it has to be stilled, but think of the peace. No more sirens, no more trauma. No more searching for truths that only bring pain. You'll be part of Oakhaven forever now, a permanent resident." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver tin. It was new, polished to a mirror finish. He held it up so I could see it. "This one is for you. I was going to use your nursing pin, but I think I want something more essential. Perhaps a lock of hair? Or maybe that silver necklace you always wear? It's the small things that hold the most weight, don't you think?" As he spoke, he began to lay out a small roll of surgical instruments on the floor beside my head. The metallic asterisk clink asterisk of the forceps and the scalpel hitting the concrete was the only sound besides the roar of the wind upstairs. I could feel my chest getting heavier. My diaphragm was starting to fail. Every breath required a conscious, monumental effort that I was slowly losing the strength to provide. I looked past him, my gaze fixed on the shadows near the boiler. My mind was racing, a frantic, trapped bird in a cage of bone. I had to do something. I had to break the cycle. My right hand was resting near a heavy iron pipe that ran along the floor. I couldn't move my arm, but I could feel my index finger, just barely. It felt like it was miles away, a tiny, twitching nerve at the end of a vast frozen landscape. I focused everything I had on that finger, every ounce of my will, every memory of the patients I'd saved, every bit of the anger I felt for Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Higgins and all the others. I didn't try to move my arm. I just tried to twitch that one finger. Sterling was distracted. He was leaning over his instrument, selecting a pair of fine-tipped scissors. He was humming again, a low, tuneless melody that made my skin crawl. He thought I was already gone, thought the transition was complete. I felt it, a tiny, microscopic movement. My finger brushed against something cold and smooth. It wasn't the pipe. It was a heavy, industrial-sized oxygen tank that had been tucked away near the archives, likely a backup for the clinic upstairs. The tank was old, its base rusted, and it was tilted slightly against the shelving unit. If I could just nudge it, if I could just tip the balance. Sterling turned back to me, the scissors in his hand. He reached out to brush a stray hair from my forehead. "Almost time, Sarah. Just a few more moments of breath, and then perfection." I gave one final, desperate surge of effort. It wasn't a movement. It was a spasm. My hand jerked an inch to the right, my knuckles slamming into the base of the oxygen tank with a dull metallic thud. The tank didn't fall. Not at first. It wobbled, the rusted base scraping against the concrete with a screech that set my teeth on edge. Sterling froze, his eyes widening. He looked at the tank, then back at me, his expression shifting from calm to a cold, murderous fury. "You shouldn't have done that," he hissed. But the momentum was already there. The tank tipped further, its heavy brass regulator catching the edge of the wooden shelving. With a deafening asterisk, crash asterisk, the shelf gave way, sending dozens of boxes of archives cascading down. The oxygen tank slammed onto the floor, the regulator snapping off against a concrete pillar. A high-pitched, screaming hiss filled the basement as the pressurized gas began to roar out of the tank. It was like a jet engine had been ignited in the small room. The force of the escaping oxygen blew dust and old papers into a swirling, chaotic vortex. Sterling scrambled back, shielding his eyes. The sudden change in pressure, the noise, the sheer chaos of the collapsing shelves, it was enough of a distraction. I felt a tiny spark of adrenaline hit my system, a primitive, primal surge that fought against the paralyzing drug. My lungs gave a jagged, desperate heave, pulling in a gulp of the pure, flowing oxygen. The air in the basement was now saturated, and right next to the leaking tank was the old boiler, its orange pilot light flickering in the wind from the broken regulator. I saw the spark. A small blue flame from the boiler was sucked into the oxygen-rich air. There was a sudden muffled asterisk, not an explosion, but a flash fire. A wall of heat that incinerated the swirling papers and turned the darkness into a blinding, searing orange. The heat was the only thing that could have saved me. It acted like a massive shot of smelling salts to my nervous system. I felt a sudden, agonizing burn on my arm, and the pain did what my will couldn't. It broke the paralysis. My hand flew up to cover my face. My legs kicked out, pushing me away from the center of the flame. Sterling was screaming, not from the fire, but from the loss. He was scrambling through the burning papers, trying to grab the leather bag of tints, trying to save his collection from the inferno. He looked like a madman, his silver hair singed, his face contorted in a mask of grief. He didn't even look at me. The people, the living people, didn't matter to him. Only the trophies did. I dragged myself toward the stairs, my limbs feeling like leaden weights, my vision blurring from the smoke. I could hear the roar of the fire behind me, the sound of the archives, 40 years of stolen lives going up in smoke. I reached the bottom step and looked back. Sterling was standing in the middle of the flames, the leather bag clutched to his chest. He was staring at me through the smoke, and for the first time, he didn't look like a doctor. He didn't look like a saint. He looked like a hollowed-out shell of a man, a ghost who had finally realized he was dead. I crawled. I pushed through the steel door into the clinic, the cold air from the snowstorm outside hitting me like a physical blow. The power was out, the building was dark, but I didn't stop. I burst through the front door and collapsed into the snow, the white, freezing drifts feeling like heaven against my scorched skin. I could see the glow of the fire through the basement windows, a flickering orange light beneath the snow. I tried to scream for help, but my voice was a raspy whisper. I lay there in the drift, the world turning white, watching the clinic burn. But then I saw the shadow. A figure emerged from the side of the building, moving through the waist-deep snow with a terrifying rhythmic gait. It wasn't the fire department. It wasn't a neighbor. It was a man carrying a leather bag, his silhouette black against the burning Victorian house. He didn't come toward me. He didn't try to finish the job. He just stood there at the edge of the woods, the snow swirling around him, and looked at me one last time. Then he turned and vanished into the white wall of the storm. I was alone. The clinic was gone. The evidence was ash, and the doctor was a ghost in the woods. But the worst part? As I lay there, freezing in the West Virginia dark, I realized I still had the peppermint tin he'd given me in my pocket. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me more than the snow that it wouldn't be the last time I'd see it. He wasn't trying to heal the town. He was just moving his garden, and I was the one who got away. Until I found the hidden file he'd left in my car, but that was for later. For now, there was only the fire and the frost. The yellow glare of the snowplow's headlights was the last thing I saw before the world went black. It looked like two small suns cutting through the blinding white of the West Virginia storm. I remember the sound of the engine, a deep, mechanical growl that felt like it was vibrating through the frozen ground beneath me. The driver, a local man named Dave who had lived in Oakhaven his entire life, found me curled in a drift 50 feet from the burning clinic. He told me later that I looked like a ghost, my skin so pale it blended into the snow, my eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the woods where the doctor had vanished. The next few hours were a blurred montage of sirens, shouting, and the biting smell of smoke. The fire department couldn't save the clinic. The old Victorian wood was like tinder, and the oxygen from the basement explosion had turned the building into a furnace. By the time the sun began to peek over the jagged rim of the valley, the Saint of Oakhaven's practice was nothing but a blackened skeleton of charred beams and cooling ash. I was taken to the regional hospital, the very place Dr. Sterling had always told patients they didn't need to go. I sat in the wrapped in a heavy wool blanket while a young nurse who didn't know my name cleaned the soot from my face. I didn't tell her I was a nurse, too. I didn't tell her anything. I just sat there clutching a plastic cup of lukewarm water, waiting for the one person I knew would come for me. Sheriff Miller arrived just after dawn. He looked older than I remembered. The lines around his eyes were deeper, and his uniform was rumpled, as if he'd dressed in the dark. He sat down in the chair next to me, his hat in his hands. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask about the fire. He just looked at the floor and whispered, "He's gone, Sarah." We searched the clinic ruins. We searched the woods as far as the ridge. There's no sign of Arthur. I finally found my voice, though it sounded like it was coming from someone else, someone far away. "Did you look under his house, Sheriff? Did you look under the floorboards of the Victorian?" He looked at me then, and for a split second, I saw it. The flicker of doubt. The shadow of a man who realized his entire world was built on a lie. He didn't say anything. He just stood up and walked out. It took them 3 days to gather enough evidence to secure a warrant for the doctor's private residence. In Oakhaven, even with a witness and a suspicious fire, people didn't want to believe that their savior was a monster. But the state police didn't have the same local ties. They brought in forensic teams from Charleston, men in white suits who didn't care about the doctor's reputation or the babies he'd delivered. They found them on a Tuesday, 42 sets of remains, meticulously preserved and tucked away beneath the floorboards of the doctor's beautiful wraparound porch. It wasn't just wedding rings and locks of hair. It was a graveyard of perfected lives. Some were older, dating back to the late 70s, while others were fresh. They found Eleanor Gable's jewelry box. They found Mr. Henderson's favorite pocket watch. And in a small lock safe in the master bedroom, they found the ledger. It wasn't a medical log. It was a diary of harvests. Dr. Sterling had recorded every detail, the exact dose of morphine or paralyzing agent used, the time it took for the heart to stop, and his own personal review of the patient's final expression. He wrote about the town as if it were a laboratory, and the people as if they were nothing more than data points in his grand experiment to define the perfect. And the town of Oakhaven broke that day. The trust that had held the community together for generations shattered like glass. People stopped talking to their neighbors. The diners sat empty. Families who had loved the doctor for 40 years suddenly had to reconcile that love with the fact that he might have been the reason their parents or grandparents died peacefully on a Friday night. But the worst part wasn't the discovery, it was the reaction. I thought I'd be the hero, the whistleblower who saved the town from its predator. I was wrong. The people of Oakhaven didn't see me as a savior. They saw me as the person who destroyed their peace. I was the outsider who had brought the fire, the one who had forced them to look into the abyss. They blamed me for the sirens, for the white-suited men digging up their history, and for the fact that their saint was now a fugitive. I moved away 3 weeks later. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I packed my life into my old sedan and drove out of the valley as the first true thaw of spring was turning the snow into mud. I didn't look back at the hardware store or the blackened ruins of the clinic. I just drove until the air didn't smell like pine and wood smoke anymore. I live in a different state now. I don't work in healthcare. I couldn't do it. I can't stand the sight of a needle, the sterile smell of a hallway, or the sound of a heart monitor. I work in a small city library, a quiet place where the only thing I have to care for are books that don't breathe and don't die. I've changed my name, I've cut my hair, I've tried to build a life out of the scraps of the person I used to be, but some things you can't leave behind. Every Friday night I find myself sitting by my window, watching the streetlights and listening for the sound of tires on gravel. I have triple bolted my door. I've installed a security system that alerts my phone every time a leaf blows past my porch. I live in a state of permanent vibrating alertness, waiting for the shadow I saw in the snow to reappear. Dr. Arthur Sterling was never caught. The police found his silver Volvo abandoned at a trailhead 60 miles from Oakhaven, but the woods swallowed him whole. Some say he died in the storm. Some say he fell into one of the old, unmarked mine shafts that honeycombed the mountains. But I know better. A man who spends 40 years planning every exit doesn't just wander into the woods to die. He had a plan. He had a bag, and he had a collection to restart. About 6 months ago, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address, just a postmark from a small town in the Pacific Northwest. I opened it with shaking hands, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Inside, wrapped in a single piece of plain white tissue paper, was a small silver tin. I didn't open it. I didn't have to. The scent hit me the moment I tore the tape, that sharp, clinical, suffocating smell of peppermint. I threw the tin into the garbage disposal and ran the blades until the metal screeched and groaned. But the smell lingered in my kitchen for days. It was a message. It was a reminder. Asterisk, I'm still practicing. I'm still gardening. And I haven't forgotten my most prized specimen. Asterisk, I realize now that the person you trust the most is the one who knows exactly where to drive the needle. They know your history, they know your weaknesses, and they know how to make your disappearance look like a natural progression. We live in a world that tells us to trust the man with the degree, the man with the silver hair, the man who brings soup to your door, but a white coat can hide a lot of blood. The case remains open, a cold file in a drawer somewhere in Charleston, but for me, it's as hot as the fire that took the clinic. I never eat peppermint anymore. I can't even walk down the candy aisle at the grocery store without my throat closing up. I sleep with the lights on, and I check the floorboards of every room I enter. He's still out there. Somewhere in a small town, a kind old man is delivering babies and holding the hands of the elderly. He's listening to their hearts, and he's deciding whose bloom is starting to fade. He's sitting in a green-shaded lamp's glow, sipping tea and waiting for Friday night. If your doctor offers you a mint to clear your head, or if they talk a little too much about the dignity of the end, do yourself a favor. Don't look at their diploma. Look at their hands. And if you smell peppermint in a room where there shouldn't be any, run. Don't look back. Just run. Because once he decides you're ready to be perfected, there is no turning back. If this story gave you the chills, please hit the like button and subscribe. It helps us keep sharing these encounters. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had a feeling that someone you trusted was hiding something dark? I'd love to hear your stories. Stay safe out there, and remember, not every angel wears wings. Some wear stethoscopes. I'm Sarah, and this was the last time I ever trusted a savior. Good night, and keep your doors locked